Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Kent Jenkins again. He is a fantastic former journalist. He began life at the Washington Post. He has lived in the South. In fact, he grew up in the South and still has that Southern accent and Southern charm. Today, we'll be discussing the immigration paradox in the US, something that seems to have receded at a time when Iran is in the air. But fear not, immigration will be back and back big time. So, Kent, welcome.
Thank you, Atul. It's very nice to be with you.
Thank you for making the time. So, the paradox that you talk about is interesting, isn't it? That Donald Trump was elected president in large part because he vowed to crack down relentlessly on illegal immigration. After all, build the wall. That was a major part of his campaign. And when he has done exactly as he has promised, quite a few Americans have turned against him. We saw the unrest in Minnesota, for instance, specifically Minneapolis, St. Paul. And not just there, but in other parts of the country too. So tell us, what is this paradox? Why isn't poor, good old Donald popular for doing exactly what he said he would?
Atul, I think it's one of the more interesting dynamics out there in that just as we're recording this, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kristi Noem, has just resigned.
She isn't secretary anymore.
No, she is. She as of the end of this month, she will not be.
As someone called her, the puppy shooter.
Exactly.
There are ruder names which we shall desist from because we are gentlemen.
And the immigration policy that Trump has employed during his first 15 months in office is deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular by almost any measure, even though Donald Trump is often criticized rightly for being inconsistent in what he says and what he does. He's been extremely consistent about saying what he did.
He's been consistent about immigration. He has been consistent about tariffs forever, right, since the 80s, actually.
And he's done, he got elected in significant part on two issues, the economy, immigration. And he said throughout his campaign in 2024 that if elected, he would close the U.S. southern border with Mexico and he would engage in a campaign of mass deportation with people. And he did exactly that. And yet, it is enormously unpopular in this country. So the question is why? Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of, I think, potential reasons that people might suggest. They might, first of all, look to Minneapolis, as you just mentioned, and the two awful shootings of Minneapolis residents, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, who were protesting in the streets and were shot to death by ICE agents.
And by the way, those who are wondering what is ICE, it is not the ice you put in your Scotch or your Coca-Cola. It isn't Ice Ice Baby, the song. It is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement
Service. And the as part of his massive deportation campaign, he put immigration and customs agents on the streets. He flooded Minneapolis with them, and there were these terrible out of control incidents that led to two people taking their lives. And certainly that has galvanized public opinion. But if you look at it, that's not the cause of why public opinion turned against Trump, because those shootings took place in January.
So hang on a minute. You're making an assertion. That public opinion has turned against Trump. Is that so? Because he was always a divisive figure. And it may just be that the people who hate Trump, and the people who support Trump still support Trump.
It's a fair question. I think if you look at a wide variety of measures, including public opinion surveys, and it's a good one.
Opinion polls.
Mm-hmm. One of the most widely respected nonpartisan polling organizations, Pew Research, mm-hmm. did a poll, has polled on this issue consistently. And when Donald Trump took office in January of 2025, about 6 out of 10 registered voters, according to the poll, approved of his immigration policy, according to Pew. It was 59%, I think. Before Halloween, by October of last year in 2025, that number had dropped to 39%. It literally had fallen by a third in 10 months. And this was well before the incidents that took the lives of two people on the streets of Minneapolis occurred. So there had been a tremendous shift in public opinion as measured by polls, and you could see it playing out on the streets of many American cities. When the Trump administration deployed immigration and customs agents in a number of cities, there was a tremendous public backlash to that. So what you can, I think, say pretty objectively, it was not the shootings in Minneapolis that caused this because the change predates that. So another potential cause would be, have Donald Trump's political adversaries done a good job mobilizing public opinion against his policy? And I think, again, the evidence that I've seen suggests the answer to that is, well, not really. I mean, there's no evidence in public opinion surveys and other objective polls that people, if you ask them what they think of democratic immigration policies, do they like them particularly? Not hugely. Less than a majority of people like them. And
I mean, the allegations, even of centrist Democrats against President Joe Biden, were that he had lost control of the border and that people from south of the border, from Latin America, not just Mexico, especially Central America, were flooding into the U.S.
and we can talk about the numbers on that, whatever your politics are. There's no question but that the Biden administration had by far the largest number of illegal crossings of the southern U.S. border of any president in history, and that Donald Trump did stop that. But again, I can't think in the last year of any Democratic public official who has had a speech or a moment that's really associated with, oh, this this really crystallized a policy that made me think Donald Trump was wrong. So if it wasn't the shootings and if it's not his political opposition, what I would argue, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, is that in fact, many, if not most, American citizens have two very different, conflicting sets of values that they hold in their minds about immigration and about immigrants and about the role of immigration in American society. It's been this way for a very long time. It's true now. And so I think that because you have these two different sets of values that compete with each other, what really is useful to think of is not to think of immigration as one issue, but as two very different issues. One of them is border security and securing our borders and keeping people safe. And the other issue is mass deportation, that is, removing immigrants, even illegal immigrants who've been here for a number of years by force, because I think what we've learned over the past years is that people feel very, very differently about those two issues. And those competing sets of values have different ones have come to the fore as the facts have changed. And let me, if I can, just to your point about the Biden administration. I think during the Trump campaign, it's just a fact that in 2022 and 2023, while Joe Biden was president, something on the order of 4 million people were either apprehended at the southern U.S. border or expelled from the country by customs agents.
by ICE agents.
ICE agents. It was, or Border Patrol, just the various police that do that. It was by far the largest number of people who had ever crossed the border illegally. There's not really a close second is about half that. And it's not that much. And when Donald Trump said he was going to close that border, he wasn't kidding. In the first 10 or 11 months of 2025, the number of apprehensions or expulsions at the border dropped by 90%. That is 90%, which is an astonishing drop in 1 year.
So Kristi Noem deserves some credit?
Depending on how you feel about it, I won't say if it's Kristi Noem. I will say that I think what happened was a lot of people who follow American politics who might have tried to cross the border decided that was a very bad idea.
Understood.
And to some degree, a lot of other folks the apprehensions went up. We had fewer people apprehended in the first 10 or 11 months of last year at the southern border than we've had in the last 50 years. It's been an astonishing change. And I think there's a lot of objective evidence that the majority of American voters liked that they wanted that. And I think there's, again, if you look at the mindset of people,
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason for that. And that's most Americans don't live on the border.
Mm-hmm.
They live far away, but they are deeply disturbed by the notion that people they don't know, they don't understand, and they can't identify are coming into the country illegally.
Mm-hmm.
And that issue of border security is one in which I think the vast majority of Americans tend to look at immigrants, and I'm putting air quotes around
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, is this kind of undifferentiated mass of people who are, they see news footage of them wading across the Rio Grande or fighting to get into this country. And they hear these numbers of people coming across in the millions, and it's very frightening to a
I
lot of
mean,
people.
I know many immigrants who came in legally who do not like the fact that people are coming in illegally. They see them as jumping the queue.
Exactly. And it is and there's no doubt that, again, whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, whatever one's politics are, there are legitimate national security and economic
Mm,
concerns about having a border that's open.
mhm,
And so I think when the focus of the Trump administration's policy was on closing the border,
mhm,
that part of it was widely popular
mm.
and it worked very well. But then, as they say, a funny thing happened. Um, what happens when people cross the border, whether they do it legally or illegally? They come into the country, and for the most part, unless they are criminals committing bad acts, they come into the country, they fan out across the country into different communities, they get jobs, they have children, they send their children to school with everybody else's children, and for the most part, they become your neighbors.
Mm.
They become part of the community. They
Or they
do
become your workers.
They become your workers. They become the people you see working the cash register or at your dry cleaner. They become people whose kids play on the same athletic teams as your kids do at school. And you don't see them as an undifferentiated, distant mass of people. You see them as individuals who you know. And suddenly, when that happens, and you're dealing with individuals who are known quantities, who you may like, and who certainly, in the vast majority of cases, do not pose a threat to anybody. Not just Americans, but human beings see that very, very differently. And sometime in the middle of last year, the Trump administration, after the border had been secured, began to deploy immigration and customs agents in large numbers onto the streets of cities all over America. They did it in Chicago, they did it in New Orleans, they did it in Charlotte, North Carolina, very near where I grew up. And in every one of these
Yeah.
cases,
Portland, Oregon,
yes,
and so on and so forth.
there was a significant blowback to
Mhm,
that in the places. And you had situations where people who said simply, when they saw people being
mhm,
arrested, people that they knew and people who had not had any history of violating the law other than coming into the country illegally,
mhm.
and that were kind of going about their business every day. And when they saw them, pulled off the streets, often by people in masks, and again, the immigration and customs agents who were deployed in something that I don't know has ever happened in America by any law enforcement agency. They masked themselves to make it difficult to identify who they were. It was shocking and appalling to many Americans, and you begin to see a real sea change. You could see it playing out during the summer on the streets of these various cities because immigration stopped being a distant issue and it became a local issue. and it became about people in your community. And where it began to change, again, oddly enough, this was not something that I think, at least in my search of the public prints, I can find that Democrats really pioneered. It was journalists, actually, who first began to note what was happening on the streets and and find a number of anecdotes that really began to get national attention, and a couple of them that people who follow the news may be familiar with.
Yes. I mean, look, that's an interesting point. But as you've yourself said, that Americans in the 1930s or before
Right.
1860s were prejudiced against people of Asian heritage. And uh,
Yeah, let me.
and that study, that's very interesting.
I,
Tell us
yeah,
about that.
I want to like let me put back to back a couple of things,
Okay.
and so that just people who follow the news may not know the name, but may remember a story from last summer where there was a gentleman whose name was Narciso Barranco, who was a landscaper. He was like about 49 or 50 years old. He had been in this country illegally for 30 years, but he had gone about his business, literally built a landscaping business. He had raised three sons who were active duty U.S. Marines. And he went to work one day thinking it was going to be a normal day, and masked ICE agents showed up, slammed him to the ground, threw him in a car, and took him away. And there was massive, it became a national story. And by the way, I would say ultimately the fact that his sons served in the Marines made him eligible for legal residency, and that, he was hauled away in a car, and that case has been dismissed. At this point, it was dismissed just recently, so it was not. But you have this thing where here's this guy, and there was another case in a rural town in Missouri called Kennett, where again a woman named Carol Mayorga had come here illegally but had raised three children. Um, and the same thing happened. She had actually kept immigration officials apprised of her whereabouts and went in for a meeting, which she thought was going to be a routine meeting, to just keep them apprised. And she was basically put behind bars and told, "We're going to deport you." That is, again, and in a very conservative town, which had voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, there was this massive public outrage. And I've seen stories from there locally of, there was one gentleman who was saying, "Listen, 95% of the people that are in this restaurant here where we're talking support Donald Trump. I do too, but this is wrong." And so you have this incredible dichotomy between what people believe ought to happen to illegal immigrants as a group, particularly when they're at a distance, and what they feel should happen to individuals they know in their community. And it's worth this
That's
is,
almost human nature. This brings us to the
and in
1930s.
fact, it is. It
Yes.
is. This is not just a couple of guys here speculating
Yeah.
about this. I, when I started kind of looking around, and I
Mhm.
asked myself, why is this? And it turns out there is an extraordinary amount of academic research from all kinds of disciplines, from sociology, from economics, from psychology, of people who've done studies of wildly differing issues who've bumped into just this phenomenon. I'm sorry to say that nobody has come up with a real catchy nickname for it that I can summarize it very quickly. I don't know if you want to call it the group individual contradiction or something like that, but it's the same thing. And I was particularly struck by the fact that one of the first studies that documented this is directly on point because it dealt with immigration. Um, and and it's almost 100 years old.
1930s.
It is.
Yeah.
There was a sociologist at Stanford University named Richard Lapierre, and at this time in the 1930s, there was enormous bias against in the U.S. against people of Chinese heritage, and it wasn't subtle. It wasn't under the table. It was obvious. I
I
mean,
mean,
it was.
remember 70 years ago to the 1930s, I think in the 1860s, the US banned Asian immigration. And that was largely because of Irish pressure, because the Irish workers didn't want to be out competed by Chinese workers.
Exactly right. And just the level of overt racism, people were unapologetic about it. And LaPierre wanted to see how that actually played out in real life. So
Just we remind our listeners that is a time when China was a de facto colony. Japan went on to invade China in the 1930s. You can see our World War II timeline if you want the exact dates. Um, Before that, all the powers were there. The British in the 19th century had already fought two opium wars, humiliated China. The French were there. The Germans had Shandong, that is Confucius's province. So China was supine at this point in history. And the words yellow, yellow livered, yellow bellied, slanty eyed, small nosed, little eyed, chinkies. We can go on, but there were lots of pejorative terms because uh, many people held the view that uh, white Europeans were of superior stock to the Chinese.
yeah, the law of the land at this point was on immigration was very specifically and explicitly racist. The Lapierre study was in the 30s. In 1924, we passed the Immigration Act of 1924. It was known as the National Origins Act, and it was very specifically structured to say we don't want immigrants from Asia, from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. We want immigrants from Northern Europe and places like Ireland. No small irony, because when the Irish came over in the mid 19th century, they too were treated as pariahs.
And they were Catholic.
That was the problem.
Yeah.
That was one of the many problems.
Hmm.
But this the law explicit, and there were, when that law was passed in the wake of World War One. I mean, the sponsor of the law wrote op-eds in the New York Times about how the melting pot experiment is over. I mean, it was a very, very explicitly racist law. And against that backdrop, Lapierre did something very clever. He wanted to see what that really meant in daily life. So, over the period of a couple of years, he traveled around the country and he visited restaurants and hotels with a couple of his students who were Chinese. They were a married couple. And they would go sit down at a restaurant or try and check into a hotel and just see what happened. And then after he did this, and he went to like 250 places and did this. And then after that, without telling these folks that he'd actually been there, he sent them a questionnaire. And one of the questions he asked was, do you have a policy forbidding service to Chinese people? And what happened was that in the survey, after the fact, of all the people who replied to the survey, 90% said, we do not serve Chinese people. We have that as our policy. In fact, during the entire time that he made these visits, his Chinese students were turned away from exactly one hotel or restaurant and refused service. So what you have is people, even 100 years ago, were saying, well, we feel this way about a group of people in the abstract. But when confronted with people who possibly were well dressed and comported themselves well and just came in
And had cash.
and had cash,
That is very important. Cash is king.
they reacted completely
Yeah.
differently. So there's this dichotomy that's always been there in human nature, and it plays out. I think I really think there's a strong case to be made that it's controlling the immigration debate, but it plays out in so much of our behavior. I think it's worth mentioning just a couple of other things along the way that have found this. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist named Thomas Schelling.
A very famous chap.
Yep, who actually back in the 60s was studying, of all things, nuclear war and deterrence
Nuclear
and
non-proliferation.
conflict
Yeah.
between nations. He's the guy who coined the phrase collateral damage, something that we've heard a whole lot. And looking at how we think about what would happen if there were a nuclear war, he said something that I think is pretty famous. The death of one person is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic.
Wasn't it Joseph Stalin who said it?
Well, I've seen it attributed to Schelling. Certainly, it was
Yeah.
Stalin who practiced it. I think if he didn't say it, and in another, again, a psychology professor at the University of Oregon named Paul Slovic, who again studies things like how we make moral decisions, has looked a lot at what happens in cases of genocide or mass murder, and in particular why otherwise decent people in societies that have been peaceful and have not waged war on a particular minority, populations suddenly turned a blind eye to episodes of genocide and kind of let mass murder and things happen. And he actually took as the title of one of his papers on this a quote from Mother Teresa: "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will." So this is just how we reason morally. We want rules, we want order, we want law to work, but I think people a lot of times sometimes see individual cases, and I think
Make an exception. I mean, it's the age-old tension in the human condition between the general and the particular. We need rules, and we have rules in society, and that brings order. But at the same time, the human situation is so complex and complicated and infinitely variable that we have to find exceptions to those rules. And so the particular may be exempt from the rules of the general.
there are people who've given a lot of thought of this who actually think this is, you could, I suppose, take the standpoint that this is just some logical conflict, and it's in human beings, aren't approaching this the right way. I think there are people who, and I tend to agree with, think this is moral reasoning. This is kind of how we try and do what's right on a large scale, but how we deal with individual cases. Not exactly a moral philosopher, but I think it was Mr. Bumble and Oliver Twist who famously observed the law is an ass, and sometimes the law is an ass, and you have to figure out how you're going to deal with those individual cases that may not fit the larger set of rules that you want. And it's I think a pretty extraordinary human capacity, to kind of rationalize these, to deal with these contradictions. But in the case of immigration, what I think has happened in the U.S. is that you have two political parties who have two different views of how immigration policy in this country ought to play out. And it seems to me it's not at all clear to me that either one of them has really grasped, or at least has acted on in a public way, this paradox that we have here. Because again, if we go back to late 2024, early 2025, when Donald Trump came into office, he recognized quite precisely the need to secure the country's southern border and enjoyed enormous support for that. But then when he expanded his immigration initiatives beyond the border out into the heartland of the country, and he began to focus on individuals, that was just, again, I think by any objective standard, widely, wildly rejected. And as we just pointed out, so wildly rejected that the
He has
head of the Department
retreated.
of Homeland Security
Yeah.
is now out of a job.
And
And
he retreated in Minnesota.
now it is an open question again whether or not now there's been one politician's sacrifice to the gods of public opinion. It's an open question whether the Trump administration's actual policy on mass deportations is going to change or not. I don't think we really know the answer to that yet. They haven't said it. If it doesn't, I think this kind of behavioral paradox suggests that Americans will continue to not want to see bands of highly armed immigration agents yanking people off the street. There's no reason to believe that that is going to change. Conversely, Democrats, I think, have somewhat surprisingly to me, perhaps. Again, you see these stories of individuals who have been taken off the street, and they spark great public outrage. They've come mostly from journalists. They've not, for the most part, come from senior Democratic officials. And I think that I actually have noticed since January, since those tragic shootings occurred on the streets of Minneapolis, that again a number of senior Democratic officials, particularly on the left wing of the party, have taken to say have said what we really need to do is abolish ICE. ICE being Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Service.
Yeah.
And I think that again is a very, very politically fraught way to go about this. Um, People who follow U.S. politics may recall that defund the police
Boomeranged.
was a politically disastrous approach taken by the left wing of the Democratic Party. I think abolish ICE has very clear echoes of that.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to see, I think, how Democrats approach this issue, but not only how the Trump administration executes its policy going forward, but how Democrats decide to address that policy. And it's an open question. I would just finish on this note. I'd have seen some recent public opinion polling, and it's interesting that again, a very legitimate source of public opinion polling, Reuters Ipsos, did a poll just a few weeks ago that found that almost 6 in 10 of people in the country think that Trump's immigration crackdown has gone too far, quote unquote. But when you ask them, so who do you think has the right idea for approaching immigration? About a third, 37%, say the Republicans have the best way.
A little more than the third.
Yeah, a little more than a third. About a third, 32% say Democrats have the best way.
5% below the
And
Republicans.
and the remainder
5% below is
yes,
quite a bit.
and the remainder, which is the largest number, 40%, 4 in 10, say they're not sure. So I think what you really have here, to me at least, that makes this interesting is this is an issue that, because I think of the emotional and the moral complexity of immigration, how people will react to this as a matter of government policy and a matter of politics really depends to a significant degree on how it's framed, on how people discuss it publicly with them. And their reactions vary dramatically depending on the specific cases that they're confronted with. So I think it's very uncertain going forward, even though you've had this tragedy in Minnesota, even though you've had a massive political backlash against the Trump administration's policy so far.
Despite a retreat in Minneapolis and a sacrifice of Kristi Noem to the gods of public opinion, the jury is still out.
The jury is still out, and I think it is very much an open case as to how this particular issue is going to play out going forward.
Brilliant. Kent Jenkins, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on as a guest on FO Podcasts. Those of you who are listening to us, make sure you follow us. You can follow us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on Amazon, and of course on YouTube. From Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, and your host today, it is bye for now.
Thank you, Atul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, sir.